The Battle of Trenton is a part of one of the most magnificent campaigns of the American Revolution. The 10 days at Christmas, 1776. If Washington had done nothing before or nothing after, those 10 days would have guaranteed him a spot in all of our history books.
Necessity, dire necessity, will, nay must, justify my attack. Victory or death. George Washington before Trenton.
On Christmas night of 1776, Washington led 2,400 of his dwindling army to the banks of the Delaware River. He planned to cross the river and attack the enemy-held town of Trenton, New Jersey. His men were Army regulars, not militia. By now, Washington was convinced that only a standing army could meet and defeat trained British forces, an army, he said, that would look the enemy in the face.
It is fearfully cold and raw, and a snowstorm setting in. The wind is northeast and beats in the faces of the men. It will be a terrible night for the soldiers who have no shoes. Some of them have tied old rags around their feet. Others are barefoot, but I have not heard a man complain. Colonel John Fitzgerald, Christmas, 1776.
John Glover's Marbleheaders, the same group that saved Washington's army through a daring nighttime evacuation from Brooklyn to Manhattan just 4 months earlier, saw to the dangerous task of ferrying the Continentals across the icy Delaware.
Glover's men have had a hard time to force the boats through the floating ice with the snow drifting in their faces. I have never seen Washington so determined as he is now. He is calm and collected, but very determined. Colonel John Fitzgerald.
The crossing took longer than expected. They still had 9 hard miles to cover in order to surprise the enemy before dawn. Surprise was possible in no small part because of the work of John Honeyman, a spy of Washington's who had infiltrated the British-paid German mercenaries, commonly called Hessians.
Throughout the war, I should add, Washington was his own spy master. He ran all kinds of spy rings inside the British Army and inside the British cities like New York and Philadelphia. But Trenton was his masterpiece. And Honeyman went into Trenton and befriended the German commander. His name was Johann Rall. And Honeyman told Rall, "Oh, I've been over on the other side of Delaware. Washington's army is falling apart. There's nothing left. He's gone. You know, there's nothing. Don't worry about the Americans. Have another drink, Colonel," and so forth. Honeyman, meanwhile, would get back to Washington and give him a complete breakdown of every move the Hessians were making, the disposition of all their sentries, the whole operation of this Hessian outpost there at Trenton.
At 7:30 in the morning, in a sleet storm, the American forces surprised the Hessians, still groggy from their Christmas festivities.
There are probably no troops, British, Hessian, or Loyalists, that would have stood against the Americans at Trenton. They were caught totally by surprise. They were disorganized, and they really didn't know what was going on. Plus, the weather was bad, and it was hard to fire their muskets.
The Hessian commander, spent after a Christmas night of drinking and gambling, tried to rally his troops.
We could hear him shouting in German, "My brave soldiers, advance!" His men were frightened and confused, for our men were firing upon them from fences and houses, and they were falling fast. It was not long before Rall tumbled from his horse, and his soldiers threw down their guns and gave themselves up as prisoners. Colonel John Fitzgerald.
Mortally wounded, Rall surrendered his sword to Washington. The American commander took 900 Hessian prisoners.
This was the victory that Americans had to have in order to turn the whole thing around. It went through The spirited American colonies, like an electric shock, you know, all the way from Carolina to Boston, the news went out that we'd won one, finally.
4 days after Trenton, Washington made an emotional appeal to the disintegrating core of his army, the Continental Regulars, who had actually enlisted for service, rather than simply volunteering as militiamen. For many, their one-year enlistment would end in 2 days, with the new year.
My brave fellows, you have done all I asked you to do and more than could be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake. Your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you will consent to stay only 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country, which you probably never can do under any other circumstances. The present is emphatically the crisis which is to decide our destiny. George Washington before Princeton.
After the speech, 200 volunteers stepped forward to renew their enlistments. Within days, they would see battle again as Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis pursued them from New York.
The British came at him with every man they could find. They had about 10,000 men, and they had him pinned against the bank of the Delaware, and it looked like it was all over. And Cornwallis, the British commander, said, "Oh, we won't attack tonight. We'll finish them off tomorrow morning." Washington left all the campfires of his army blazing and left like 3 men to throw wood on the fire, and he took his army and he marched around the British flank.
Again, Washington had escaped the much larger British force, but his army met a smaller British force here at Princeton. The weary Continentals fell into retreat at the attack of the British line.
Washington appeared in front of the American army, riding towards those of us who were retreating, and exclaimed, "Parade with us, my brave fellows. There is but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." A Continental sergeant at Princeton.
I shall never forget what I felt at Princeton on his account. When I saw him brave all the dangers of the field and his important life hanging, as it were, by a single hair with 1,000 deaths flying around him. Believe me, I thought not of myself. A Pennsylvania volunteer.
As he would do countless times in battle, Washington rallied his troops by virtue of his own bravery. Throughout the war, his life seemed charmed.
He had a lot of physical courage. He almost believed that he was invulnerable to bullets. He had 3 horses shot out from under him. He had bullet holes in his clothes. His hat was shot away, but he was never himself scratched once by a bullet or a bayonet. And he exposed himself constantly.
Several months earlier in New York, British buglers sounded a fox hunting tune as they pursued Washington and his fleeing army. Still smarting from the insult, Washington now shouted, "It's a fine day for a fox chase, my boys," and spurred his horse after the retreating redcoats. As at Trenton, the British were routed. Washington didn't linger to savor his second victory in 9 days. Instead, he rushed his army into winter quarters in the mountains near Morristown, New Jersey.
You look at the map, from that location, he would have been astride or on the flank of the lines of communication, supply lines of the British leading across the state of New Jersey. The British could not get at him back in those mountains in the winter with an army in that day and age, so they had no choice but to leave New Jersey. So by winning 2 battles, very small battles really in terms of the numbers of soldiers engaged on either side, and by an operational maneuver, he wedged, or outgeneraled, if you will, the British completely out of New Jersey. And so when the campaigning ended, the British had New York City. That's all they had to show for the largest expeditionary force they ever had sent anywhere for an entire year's of campaigning.
General William Howe seemed in no hurry to retaliate for the defeats at Trenton and Princeton. After all, he controlled the city of New York and was enjoying an affair with one of the most attractive women in America, Elizabeth Loring, the wife of his Loyalist commissary of prisoners, Joshua Loring. Francis Hopkinson, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, would soon poke fun at Howe with a clever verse.
Sir William he, snug as a flea, lay all this time a-snoring, nor dreamed of harm as he lay warm in bed with Mrs. Loring. Francis Hopkinson.